The year 2021, in Afghanistan, was the year of the Taliban par excellence. This movement returned to power in Kabul after an absence of 20 years. She returned to the corpse of President Ashraf Ghani's government, which had fallen, and with it the West's bet on establishing a central Afghan government that would come to power and leave it, through the election boxes. The return of the Taliban also represented a defeat for the United States, which packed its bags and left a country that had drained it, humanly and materially, for 2 decades in an endless war. America was not defeated militarily, but the same Taliban was longer than it. Also, getting out of the cemetery of empires was necessary to correct the compass in the direction of the real danger that threatens the continuation of American hegemony in the world. This danger, as the Americans say, no longer stems from international terrorism as much as it comes from opponents such as China and Russia. What does the Taliban's return to power mean? Are there real fears that Afghanistan, under its rule, will become a magnet for militant groups, as was the case in its first version before 2001? This report deals with some of the challenges and threats expected from the new Afghanistan under the rule of the Taliban in its second version. The road to Kabul. The Taliban took power in the Afghan capital after the chaotic fall of President Ashraf Ghani's government last August. The handover process, as envisioned by the Americans who bet, in the Doha Agreement with the Taliban on February 29, 2020, did not result in intra-Afghan negotiations leading to the formation of a partnership government that includes the movement and the administration of President Ghani. The Americans pressured Ghani to abdicate. He gave in, but not to the extent the Taliban wanted. Americans pressed more. Did not listen to them. In fact, the Taliban was not in a hurry to form a government of which it is only a part. Why should it join a government with others, as long as it can possess it all? This was crystal clear in the months before Ghani fled Kabul. The Afghan government forces that Americans have spent billions of dollars on training and equipping over the past 20 years suddenly seem to have lost the will to fight. It was handing over its positions successively in front of the advance of the Taliban. The collapse intensified after the Americans lifted the air cover they were providing for the Afghan army and police positions. It is likely that the debate over who is responsible for the collapse of the Afghan forces will continue for a long time. The Americans will argue that the Afghan soldiers laid down their arms and did not fight properly. Afghan leaders will respond that they sacrificed thousands of their soldiers but that the Americans left them prey to their enemies after they began evacuating their bases and stopped providing support to the Afghan army, except in very limited cases. In mid-August, the Taliban were knocking on the doors of Kabul. Did not attack her. The undeclared understanding with the Americans stipulated that entering the capital would take place in agreement with its administration. What the Americans did not expect was Ghani's escape, without warning and without coordination with them. Ghani feared, perhaps, that he would meet the fate of former President Najibullah, who was seized by the Taliban forces from the United Nations headquarters in Kabul in 1996 and hanged with his brother from a lamppost in a public street. Ghani himself justifies his escape by saying that he wanted to spare the capital a bloody fight if he decided to stay and resist. Ghani's flight and the fall of his government caused panic among thousands of Afghans who had worked for years within the Afghan government's departments and security services and are now at the mercy of their former opponents. Many of those gathered in the capital were originally government employees and family members who had fled other areas captured by the Taliban. These displaced people, and other frightened residents of Kabul, had no other way to escape now that the Taliban had taken control of most of the country and had begun to encircle Kabul. The only exit was Hamid Karzai International Airport. They flocked there in the tens of thousands, trying to board any departing plane through the air bridge set up by the United States and other governments to evacuate foreigners and their collaborators. The scenes of the chaotic evacuation of foreigners and Afghans from Kabul airport brought to mind images of the American withdrawal from Saigon in 1975, when Vietnamese planes were caught taking off from the roof of the American embassy before the Viet Cong forces took control of the capital of what was then South Vietnam. The sad scene was repeated in Kabul this time. Afghan citizens tried to get attached to U.S. planes taking off from the airport, but they fell out of them shortly after taking off. And images of Afghans running behind departing planes will likely remain a symbol that will remind Americans, for decades to come, of their failure in Afghanistan. Taliban government. The Taliban entered Kabul, the victors entered. There was no resistance from the former government forces, many of whose members had taken off their uniforms and gathered around the capital's airport, waiting to be evacuated, like tens of thousands of others crowded around the airport walls, hoping to escape on any departing plane. The truth is that the Taliban did not do what many feared it would do, specifically committing atrocities against its former opponents. The movement, through its senior officials who took office in Kabul, sent messages of reassurance to all its opponents that it would not harm them and that a new page had been opened with them and that it wanted them to be a part of Afghanistan's future. What is more, the movement spoke of its desire to form an inclusive government, which was interpreted as the inclusion of figures affiliated with the previous administration in the new authority. Taliban officials have already met with prominent figures from the former regime who did not leave Kabul, and some of them were already part of the failed Doha negotiations with the movement, such as former President Hamid Karzai and the head of the Supreme Council for Reconciliation Abdullah Abdullah. However, these contacts did not seem to result in an agreement to involve any of these people in the new authority. The Taliban announced its first government of leaders in the movement from ethnic Pashtuns, with a clear marginalization of other components of Afghan society, such as Tajiks, Uzbeks, and Hazaras. What's more, the Taliban has given prominent positions in its government to formerly designated terrorist elements, such as the top leaders of the so-called Haqqani network, or to former prisoners in Guantanamo or Afghan government prisons. This suggested that the movement might want to return to its first version of its hardline rule, knowing that this step could also be interpreted as stemming from the Taliban's efforts to please a segment of its elements who believe that the victory that has been achieved is the result of the sacrifices of the fighters on the ground and not as a result of negotiations political leaders with the Americans in Doha. In any case, the first Taliban government immediately found itself before the test of transforming from an insurgency movement to an authority responsible for providing for the needs of its people, a daunting task in a country like Afghanistan, from which its educated children are fleeing, and its banks suffer from empty coffers, while its foreign deposits are frozen, and its economy is collapsing, after it was based for many years on aid coming from abroad, but it has now dried up after the fall of the Afghan government. What is more, the Taliban government found itself facing international fears and warnings of a very serious humanitarian crisis that will face millions of Afghans during the harsh winter. This humanitarian situation was a key factor behind the movement of Islamic countries, led by Saudi Arabia and Pakistan, to hold a meeting of the Organization of the Islamic Conference, in December, dedicated to helping the Afghan people. Terrorist challenge. The new Taliban government faced little challenge from the remnants of the previous regime, which collapsed quickly with the American withdrawal. The hardcore of these retreated to its traditional stronghold in the Panjshir Valley, north of Kabul, which constituted a formidable obstacle to the rule of the first Taliban in the 90s of the last century and the beginning of the new millennium. But Ahmed Massoud, son of the famous Tajik leader Ahmed Shah Massoud, who repulsed the Taliban in Panjshir and prevented it from completing its control over Afghanistan, failed to repeat his father's achievement this time. The movement's fighters stormed his stronghold after a short battle and managed to defeat his supporters, who fled to other countries or retreated to fortifications in remote mountains. The truth is that these opponents were not able to stop the movement, despite the fact that they benefited from the difficult terrain of their region. They were isolated from the outside world, and no party was willing to provide them with weapons in the face of the new government in Kabul. Massoud's son pleaded with the Americans for his support, but they did not respond to his request. It is not believed that there is a serious threat to the rule of the Taliban in the new year at the hands of its marginalized opponents of the ethnic Tajiks, Uzbeks, and Hazaras. The ISIS threat, Khorasan Province. In contrast to the absence of the threat from the factions of the former regime and the marginalized ethnicities of the new rule in Kabul, the Taliban is facing a challenge of another kind. There is the ISIS threat that has emerged from the same environment as the Taliban and among its leaders, who resent their insufficient militancy. The threat to them is concentrated in the eastern provinces of the country, especially in Kunar and Nangarhar, where hundreds, perhaps a few thousand, fighters of the Khorasan province, the branch of ISIS in Afghanistan, are holed up. They have faced the Afghan security forces for years, as they have faced the Taliban fighters, who were unable to subdue them, despite sometimes receiving air support from U.S. forces and the forces of the former Afghan government. The danger of ISIS has emerged in particular after the Taliban took control of power and opened the doors of prisons behind which a large number of Khorasan province fighters and leaders were being held. Indeed, this organization hastened to flex its muscles with a series of suicide bombings. The first targeted the American forces supervising the air bridge at Kabul airport, killing 13 American soldiers, while the second and third bombings targeted 2 mosques of the Hazara Shiites in Kunduz and Kandahar, which led to dozens of casualties. The Khorasan province was not satisfied with these attacks, but also resorted to launching lightning operations, in particular by planting explosive devices targeting Taliban elements in the east of the country in particular. The Taliban responded, it seems, with extrajudicial killings of ISIS fighters. It is not clear how the conflict between the Taliban and ISIS will end, but indications suggest that the first party will not allow the second to pose a threat to its rule, which portends a greater confrontation between the two parties that may be witnessed in the new year. External terrorist threat. However, the terrorist threat is not actually limited to ISIS, as Afghanistan today faces the dangers of becoming again an arena for attracting so-called foreign jihadists, as it was in the 1990s. At the time, during the first version of the Taliban rule, Afghanistan was a factory for the breeding of militants who were flocking to camps set up by various foreign groups to train their elements before sending them on foreign operations. Al-Qaeda stole the glow from these people as a result of its carrying out the September 11, 2001 attacks from Afghanistan. But the truth is that the Afghan arena at that time was a rear base for a large number of banned groups in its country, which moved to reside under the rule of Mullah Omar, the leader of the Taliban. Al-Qaeda's allegiance to Mullah Omar did not prevent this organization from carrying out the September 11 attacks, and before that many other terrorist attacks, despite the controversy within Osama bin Laden's organization about the legality of launching attacks without the permission of the Taliban leader. It is now assumed that al-Qaeda's pledge of allegiance to the leader of the Taliban is still continuing after Dr. Ayman al-Zawahiri assumed leadership to succeed Osama bin Laden, and after Mullah Akhundzada assumed leadership of the Taliban, succeeding Mullah Akhtar Mansur, who in turn assumed leadership of the movement after the death of Mullah Omar. Today, Taliban leaders are repeating their pledge not to allow any group to exploit the territory of Afghanistan to threaten an external party, which means that al-Zawahiri's organization, or any other organization, will not be free to repeat attacks from Afghanistan. It is assumed that this will include, for example, the Chinese Uyghurs, the Uzbeks, the Tajiks, and Arab groups that were previously active from Afghanistan. In fact, it is not clear whether al-Zawahiri himself has moved or is planning to move now to reside in Afghanistan, especially since he may be freer in his current hiding place to continue inciting attacks against the Americans, which is something he has been doing in his media releases, but the Taliban won't allow it now. In fact, al-Qaeda does not need Afghanistan, in particular, to prepare to attack the Americans. It has its cells inside the tribal areas of Pakistan. It has a presence inside Iran itself, sometimes coordinating with its intelligence services. Its branches are also active in more than one country, whether through the Al-Shabaab movement, al-Qaeda's branch in East Africa, or through the Jama'at Nusrat al-Islam and Muslims and al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb in North Africa and the African coast. Al-Qaeda also has its branch in Syria, represented by the Guardians of Religion organization, which maintained allegiance to al-Zawahiri after Jabhat al-Nusra in its new form, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, broke its allegiance to him. The presence of all these branches of al-Qaeda relieves pressure on the organization's leadership to use Afghanistan again as a launching pad for planning its attacks. However, despite this, there is information circulating on a small scale indicating that al-Qaeda members have already moved with their families to areas in southern Afghanistan where they are currently living under the rule of the Taliban. However, it is not yet clear whether their presence could later turn into a version similar to what al-Qaeda had in the past. The new year will likely bring clearer indications of the type of relationship that will develop between the Taliban and its new guests. Taliban currents. Undoubtedly, the presence of foreign jihadists is also linked to a purely internal Afghan file that is related to the existence of currents within the Taliban that represent more extremist ideology than other currents. In this context, it will be important to clarify the position of the powerful Haqqani network within the new ruling structure of the Taliban in Kabul. It was widely reported in the first days following the Taliban's takeover of the Afghan capital, last August, that a major dispute occurred between the leaders of the movement, who were divided between a military current dominated by the Haqqani network and the political wing that negotiated and represented the Americans in Doha. In particular, Mullah Abdul Ghani Baradar. Information at the time indicated that the military argued that the victory was in large part due to their sacrifices and not to the politicians who were negotiating in luxury hotels and touring the capitals of the world. The absence of Mullah Baradar from Kabul at the time gave rise to rumors that he had gone to Kandahar to complain to Mullah Akhundzada. But the Taliban denied the existence of differences in its ranks, stressing that the Haqqani network is an integral part of it. In return for this denial, skeptics insist that the Haqqani network actually includes more extremist parties than others within the Taliban, considering that the activity of foreign militant groups can most likely occur in the areas controlled by this network in the southeast of the country on the border with Pakistan. Undoubtedly, this opinion intersects with the fact that the Pakistani Taliban branch, Tehrik-Pakistan Taliban, has a clear extension within the areas of southeastern Afghanistan, where the movement's fighters take it as a launchpad for their attacks inside Pakistan and a refuge to hide from the response of Pakistani forces. Given the fact of this link between the Afghan Taliban and the Pakistani Taliban, it was not surprising that the former played a role in arranging the negotiations that took place recently between the government of Prime Minister Imran Khan and the leaders of the Taliban movement. And the position of the supreme leader of the Afghan Taliban, Mullah Akhundzada, will likely be pivotal, whether in terms of settling disputes within the Taliban itself, between politicians and the military, or in terms of the relationship with foreign extremist groups such as Al-Qaeda or Tehrik-Taliban, especially that these groups that living under his protection, she is supposed to be sworn allegiance to him. But little is known about Akhundzada, who appears to be following in the footsteps of Mullah Omar. There is only one picture of him that was distributed when he assumed the leadership of the Taliban, succeeding Mullah Akhtar Mansur years ago. The only difference between it and the orphan picture of Mullah Omar is that the latter was from afar and unclear, while Akhundzada's picture was official in which he appears clearly. The Taliban has never distributed any other pictures showing the face of Akhundzada, who seems to live in seclusion in Kandahar, leaving the administration in Kabul to the leaders of his movement, content with general directives of the policies that his government is supposed to follow. The year 20